The Taliban could regain a political foothold in Afghanistan as soon as next year. Afghan President Khamid Karzai says the Taliban leader could run for presidency in the 2014 election, but the militants would have to renounce terrorism and violence there. NATO is pulling out its troops by the end of Karzai's term, with the Afghan government pushing for peace talks. However, the Taliban are refusing to speak directly with President Karzai, describing him as an American puppet. But they recently announced a readiness to enter politics and have opened an office in Doha to facilitate peace talks with the US. RT contributor Afshin Rattansi says NATO's conduct in the war zone is only helping the insurgents gain political ground.
The American public may be thinking, what was the point of this? The bereaved relatives of all those thousands dead. They must be getting a very strange picture of Afghanistan if the Taliban under Mullah Omar is going to run Afghanistan. Is it going to be a pullout? Of course, lots of people are asking. There are 150,000 NATO troops there now, and already people are talking about 15,000 remaining on 5 different bases. The continuous drone attacks and the atrocities committed by US, NATO and ISAF troops, of course, do catalyze pro-Taliban support. It was only in the past week or so that a US commando unit were thrown out of Nurk province after allegations of complicity in kidnapping, torture and summarily executing people in Nurk province. Karzai told the Americans they better get out. And of course, those kinds of atrocities are bound to catalyze Taliban support.
And RT's Lucy Catherine, who's been to Afghanistan and covers the region, explains what's behind Karzai's recent announcement.
He's made this point numerous times before, calling for the Taliban to participate in elections, is that Afghanistan is so open and democratic that even Mullah Omar, were he to disarm, essentially, could run for office. Of course, the reality is that this is a complete political non-starter because the Taliban have been very clear in their position. They do not see the Karzai government as being legitimate. They've openly called it as a puppet of the United States. They refuse to hold any sort of negotiations, much less view the Constitution as legitimate or offer any sort of candidates. So again, this is just sort of wishful thinking, perhaps, or rather a rhetorical remark by President Khamid Karzai than any sort of reality on the ground. Because the Taliban has refused to negotiate with him, there really isn't very much that Karzai can do in the situation. For the Taliban, the number one position is effectively to remove all foreign troops from the ground in Afghanistan. In order to do that, why negotiate with the so-called puppet government when we can talk to the occupiers themselves? But there's divisions within the Taliban as well. Do they actually hold negotiations, or do they fight until the occupiers, the U.S. forces, leave the country? There's also divisions within the Obama administration about this, because while this war has been incredibly costly to the United States, and the Taliban have long been an enemy for the U.S., many factions in the administration see a political solution as the only possible sort of way forward. I mean, it's been more than clear that military might isn't enough to eradicate the Taliban, so somehow talks have to take place. But at the end of the day, I don't think anyone actually realistically expects peace with the Taliban anytime in the next few years, for sure. When I was in Afghanistan, most of the Afghans that I've spoken to have seen this deadline with looming trepidation. In fact, they think that once the Americans draw down, and there's no indication that the Americans will fully withdraw from the country, but of course it will leave a massive power vacuum. There's the potential for the country to descend into civil war. And it also really remains to be seen what happens with the elections in 2014, because again, if the country isn't seen as sort of having a legitimate, non-corrupt elections, it really could spark much further unrest than we've seen so far.